Dear listeners, welcome to this delightful audiobook edition of Miss Marple and the Auction House Mystery. Settle in with a cup of tea, perhaps a knitted shawl around your shoulders, and allow yourself to be transported to the charming village of St. Mary Mead in the peaceful England of the early 1950s. Here, amidst blooming gardens and friendly gossip, our dear Miss Jane Marple, sharp as ever in her observations of human nature, unravels a puzzling affair with her trademark quiet wisdom. This tale is divided into 10 chapters for your convenience. Enjoy the mystery. Chapter 1. The exciting sale at Meadowbrook House. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the lanes wandered lazily between hedgerows bright with autumn berries and the church clock chimed the hours with dependable regularity, life proceeded at a pace that suited its inhabitants perfectly. It was early October in the year 1952, and the air held that pleasant crispness that made walking a pleasure and sitting by a fire even more so. Miss Jane Marple lived in a small, neat house on the high street with a garden that was the envy of many, though she would always protest that it was merely the result of a little care and the excellent soil. On this particular morning she was seated in her drawing room, a ball of pale pink wool in her lap, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a baby's jacket. There was no expectant mother in immediate prospect, but Miss Marple believed in being prepared. One never knew when such a garment might be required in a village where weddings and christenings followed one another in agreeable succession. She had just completed the second sleeve when the postman delivered a letter that caused her mild blue eyes to brighten with interest. It was from her old friend Mrs. Bantry, who lived at nearby Gossington Hall and whose late husband, Colonel Bantry, had been a cousin to the recently deceased Reginald Hargreaves of Meadowbrook House. The letter contained an invitation to the preview of the auction of Mr. Hargreaves's effects, to be held by the firm of Pendergast and Sons in the converted stables of Meadowbrook itself. Mrs. Bantry added a postscript in her impulsive scrawl. "Do come, Jane dear. It will be quite an event. Everyone is going." Miss Marple laid down her knitting and considered the matter. She had known Reginald Hargreaves slightly, a tall, irascible man who had spent much of his life in the Far East and returned to Meadowbrook with a collection of furniture, silver, and pictures that were the talk of the county. His sudden death a fortnight earlier, attributed to heart failure, had caused regret but no great surprise. He had been nearing 70 and had not taken care of himself. Now the house and its contents were to be sold to settle debts, and the village looked forward to the auction with the keen anticipation reserved for any break in routine. Accordingly, on the following Thursday, a fine, clear morning with only a hint of mist lingering in the hollows, Miss Marple set out. She wore her best tweed coat, a neat felt hat, and carried a sturdy umbrella that served as much as walking stick as protection against rain. The walk to Meadowbrook House took her along a pleasant lane bordered by elm trees, their leaves turning gold, and past cottages whose gardens still bloomed with late roses and Michaelmas daisies. Meadowbrook House itself stood back from the road behind a sweep of gravel and a screen of rhododendrons. It was a handsome Georgian building, somewhat neglected in recent years, but the stables, a long, low range of red brick, had been swept and garnished for the occasion. As Miss Marple approached, she could see trestle tables arranged beneath the open doors, laden with porcelain, glass, silver, and furniture. A small notice announced, "Preview today, 10:04, auction tomorrow." Inside the improvised sale room, the atmosphere was one of restrained excitement. Mr. Edmund Pendergast, the auctioneer, stood near the largest table greeting visitors with professional heartiness. He was a stout, red-faced man in his middle 50s, dressed in a dark suit and wielding a catalogue as though it were a baton. His voice carried easily over the murmurs of the crowd. "Ah, Miss Marple, delighted to see you. Some very fine pieces here. Very fine indeed. That Worcester dessert service now. Early 19th century, perfect condition. Miss Marple smiled politely and moved on, her sharp eyes taking in the gathering. There was Major Palgrave, retired from the Indian Army, and a familiar figure at any local sale, peering short-sightedly at a collection of ivory carvings. Miss Hartnell, brisk and energetic in a green tweed suit, was examining a set of fish knives with critical attention. She had, Miss Marple recalled, contributed several lots herself from her late brother's collection. Mrs. Lydia Dane, Mr. Hargreaves's widowed niece, and the chief beneficiary under his will, stood a little apart, elegant in black, her face pale but composed. She had arrived from London only the previous week to oversee arrangements. Near the silver table stood Mr. Victor Blaine, a dealer from London whose occasional visits to country sales were always noted with interest. He was a thin, dark man with quick, observant eyes, and he was bending over the chief glory of the sale, a magnificent Georgian silver epergne, its branches rising in graceful scrolls, its surface gleaming under the electric lights that had been temporarily installed. Miss Marple paused beside him. "A beautiful piece," she remarked mildly. Blaine straightened and gave her a courteous nod. "Indeed it is, madam. One of the finest I've seen outside a museum, Sheffield plate, circa 1770, possibly by Matthew Bolton himself." Young Mr. Lionel Trent, Mr. Pendergast's assistant, hovered nearby, ready to answer questions. He was a good-looking young man in his late 20s, neatly dressed and eager to please. Miss Marple noticed how he watched his employer with a mixture of deference and something that might have been ambition. The preview continued peacefully enough. People moved from table to table, lifting objects, consulting catalogues, exchanging opinions in low voices. Tea was served in the adjoining harness room, and Miss Marple accepted a cup, listening to the talk around her. There was speculation about prices, reminiscences of Mr. Hargreaves's eccentricities, and a certain amount of sympathetic comment on Mrs. Dane's position. She would inherit the house but little else, for debts and death duties had swallowed most of the estate. It was as the afternoon drew on and the crowd began to thin that the first shadow fell across the proceedings. Miss Marple, having purchased a small Worcester vase for a modest sum, was preparing to leave when she noticed a small knot of people near the rostrum that Mr. Pendergast had erected for the following day's sale. The auctioneer himself stood there, catalogue in hand, describing the epergne to a potential bidder. Suddenly his voice faltered. He swayed, clutched at the edge of the rostrum, and then collapsed heavily to the floor. There was a moment of stunned silence, broken by Mrs. Dane's sharp cry. Young Trent sprang forward, loosening the stricken man's collar. Someone ran for Dr. Haydock, who by good fortune was visiting a patient nearby. But when the doctor arrived, breathless and concerned, his examination was brief. "I'm afraid he's gone," he said quietly. "Heart failure by the look of it. Very sudden." The little gathering broke up in shocked whispers. Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, watched as the body was carried away and the sale room closed for the day. 2 deaths in a fortnight, both apparently from heart failure, both connected with Meadowbrook House and its contents. Coincidence, perhaps. Yet Miss Marple's long experience of village life had taught her that human nature was rarely content with simple coincidence. As she walked home through the lengthening shadows, her thoughts were busy. The auction would no doubt be postponed, questions would be asked, and in the peaceful routines of St. Mary Mead, a new and puzzling pattern was beginning to form. Chapter 2. Suspects and Whispers. The death of Mr. Edmund Pendergast cast a shadow over St. Mary Mead that no autumn sunshine could quite dispel. The auction was postponed indefinitely, the stables at Meadowbrook House locked and silent, and the village settled down to the serious business of discussion. In shops, in gardens, over garden walls, and across tea tables, the same questions were asked again and again. Had the auctioneer suffered from a weak heart? Was the shock of poor Mr. Hargreaves's recent death too much for him? Or was there, perhaps, something more? Miss Marple, walking to the post office the morning after the tragedy, heard the matter debated in half a dozen variations before she reached the door. Mrs. Price Ridley, emerging with a parcel of wool, stopped her at once. "Such a dreadful thing, Miss Marple. 2 deaths in a fortnight, and both men connected with that sale. It makes one think." "It does indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Though, of course, heart failure is very common in men of Mr. Pendergast's age and build." Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips. "All the same, I've heard that Mrs. Dane was most upset about the sale going forward. She wanted to keep the house as it was, family pieces and all. And now this happens. Very convenient for her, one might say." Miss Marple made a small non-committal sound and passed on. She had learned long ago that village speculation was often wide of the mark, yet it sometimes contained a grain of truth that could be useful. That afternoon she accepted an invitation to tea at Gossington Hall. Mrs. Bantry, always hospitable and always eager for company after any excitement, greeted her warmly. "Come in, Jane dear, come in. I've been longing to talk to someone sensible. The telephone has hardly stopped ringing with people wanting to know what I think about poor Mr. Pendergast." The tea was excellent. Thin bread and butter, homemade blackberry jam, and a Victoria sponge still warm from the oven. Between bites, Mrs. Bantry poured out her impressions. "Lydia Dane is staying with me, you know. She was terribly upset yesterday. Says she feels responsible somehow because it happened at Meadowbrook, but really what could she have done? Reginald left debts and the sale had to go forward." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Mrs. Dane must find it very trying, to lose her uncle and then to have the contents of the house dispersed." Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. "Exactly. She told me only last week that she had begged him not to sell the silver especially. Family pieces, you know. The Epergne has been at Meadowbrook since her great-grandfather's time. But Reginald was adamant, said he needed the money and that was that." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "the sale is now delayed. That must be a relief to her." Mrs. Bantry looked thoughtful. "I suppose it is. Though of course it can't be permanent. The creditors won't wait forever." Later, as Miss Marple walked home through the village, she turned these matters over in her mind. Delay might indeed be valuable to Mrs. Dane if she hoped to raise money elsewhere or contest some part of the will. Motive enough, perhaps, if one were looking for motives. The following day brought a visit from young Mr. Lionel Trent. He appeared at Miss Marple's door in some agitation, hat in hand, asking if he might speak to her for a moment. "Of course, Mr. Trent, come in. A cup of tea?" He accepted gratefully and sat perched on the edge of a chair as though ready for instant flight. "It's about poor Mr. Pendergast," he began. "The police have been asking questions, you see, and I thought, well, you were there, Miss Marple, and you noticed things." Miss Marple poured tea and waited. "The thing is," Trent continued, "Mr. Pendergast had no history of heart trouble that I ever heard of. He was always boasting about his constitution. And then to go off like that so suddenly—" "It was very shocking," Miss Marple agreed, "but such things do happen." Trent hesitated. "There's talk in the village about poison." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Village talk is often exaggerated, Mr. Trent. Though I believe Dr. Haydock has sent for a post-mortem. We shall know more soon." Trent colored slightly. "Yes, of course. Only, I wondered if you had noticed anything unusual that afternoon. Anyone near the rostrum, perhaps, or tampering with Mr. Pendergast's things." Miss Marple considered. I did notice that Mr. Blaine, the dealer from London, spent a long time examining the Epernay, and Major Palgrave was close by at one point. Miss Hartnell, too, she was complaining about the valuation of her brother's fish knives. Trent leaned forward. Mr. Blaine has a certain reputation, I believe. Sharp practices. And the Major, well, he bid against Mr. Pendergast quite fiercely over some ivory pieces the day before. Quarrels over valuations are common enough at auctions, Miss Marple said gently. Though I did hear Miss Hartnell say that Mr. Pendergast had deliberately undervalued her lots to spite her. Trent nodded eagerly. Exactly. And then there's Mrs. Dane. She had every reason to want the sale stopped. Miss Marple looked at him over her spectacles. And you, Mr. Trent, as Mr. Pendergast's assistant, you would benefit if the business passed to you. Trent flushed deeply. I never wished him harm, Miss Marple, truly. He was teaching me the trade, and I was grateful. But yes, if anything happened to him, I might have the chance to carry on alone. Quite, said Miss Marple. Human nature is very complex, is it not? After Trent left, Miss Marple sat thoughtful. 5 people, each with something to gain or something to fear from the auction proceeding. Mrs. Dane wishing to preserve the family inheritance. Mr. Blaine perhaps anxious to conceal some irregularity in the provenance of a valuable piece. Major Palgrave resentful over a disputed lot. Miss Hartnell angry about undervaluation, and young Trent ambitious for advancement. And somewhere among the everyday objects in those stables, the silver, the porcelain, the furniture, lay the reason why 2 men had died within a fortnight. Outside, the autumn leaves drifted gently from the trees, and the village went about its quiet business. But Miss Marple, finishing the second sleeve of the pink jacket and casting on for the border, knew that the whispers were only beginning. Chapter 3. Village gossip and initial clues. The days following Mr. Pendergast's death passed in a flurry of quiet activity. The inquest was opened and adjourned pending the results of the post-mortem, and Inspector Slack from the county police arrived to make inquiries. He was a large, brisk man who believed in direct questions and disliked what he called old ladies' fancies. Miss Marple, encountering him outside the post office, received a curt nod and no more. Undeterred, she pursued her own gentle investigations. On the pretext of returning a library book, she called at the vicarage, where the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was always ready for a cup of tea and a chat. "The whole village is talking of nothing else," Mrs. Clement said, passing the biscuit tin. "Major Palgrave was in here yesterday telling the most blood-curdling stories about poisons he'd encountered in India. Cyanide, I think he said. Smells of bitter almonds. Quite put me off my lunch." Miss Marple helped herself to a pitted 4. "Major Palgrave does enjoy his stories, though I believe he was speaking of prussic acid, which is indeed derived from cyanide, very rapid in its effects." Mrs. Clement shuddered delicately. "Horrible. And then there's poor Miss Hartnell. She's convinced Mr. Pendergast deliberately undervalued her brother's fish knives out of spite. She was quite vehement about it at the Women's Institute meeting." "Miss Hartnell is often vehement," Miss Marple observed, "but she has a strong sense of justice." From the vicarage, she proceeded to the Blue Boar, where the landlord's wife was polishing glasses in the private parlor. "Mr. Blaine, the London gentleman, was in last night," she confided. "Left suddenly this morning, train to town. Said business called him back urgently. Funny that, after coming all this way for the sale." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Blaine's departure might be innocent, or it might not. That same afternoon she walked out to Meadowbrook House itself. The stables were still locked, but the gardens were open, and she encountered the maid Gladys hanging out washing on the line behind the kitchen. "Such a shock it was, miss," Gladys said, pausing with a peg in her hand. Mr. Pendergast took his tea in the office every afternoon at 4 sharp. strong with 3 lumps of sugar and a dash from a little bottle he kept on the desk. Said it settled his indigestion. "A little bottle?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Yes, miss. Brown glass with a label, Heart Tonic," it said, though he always laughed and called it his special pick-me-up. Miss Marple filed the information away, a bottle to which others might have access. Later, sitting in her own garden with her knitting, she reviewed what she had learned. The faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds had been noticed by Gladys when she cleared away the cup after the collapse, though in the shock of the moment no one had paid much attention. Cyanide, then, possibly. But how administered, and why? The Colonel's death, too, began to seem less straightforward. Dr. Haydock, encountering Miss Marple at the butcher's, admitted privately that he was not entirely satisfied. "Reginald Hargreaves had a weak heart, certainly," he said in a low voice. "I'd prescribed digitalis. But the suddenness, well, the post-mortem on Pendergast may tell us something." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to digitalis. Foxgloves grew abundantly in the Meadowbrook garden. Mrs. Dane had been seen gathering leaves only the week before the Colonel died, ostensibly for an infusion for her nerves. Yet Mrs. Dane had been in London at the time of Pendergast's death, or so she claimed. Alibis would need checking. A small red herring presented itself the next morning in the form of an anonymous letter delivered to Inspector Slack. It suggested that Mr. Blaine had been involved in forging provenance papers for certain items in the sale, and that exposure would ruin him. The handwriting was careful, almost too careful, and Miss Marple, shown a copy by a gossipy neighbor, recognized the precise upright script as remarkably similar to Miss Hartnell's. A deliberate misdirection, perhaps. Miss Hartnell was quite capable of such a maneuver if she believed it would punish someone she considered dishonest. Major Palgrave provided another distraction when he called upon Miss Marple to borrow a book on tropical diseases. "Fascinating stuff, poison," he boomed. "In India we carried cyanide capsules, quick way out if captured, don't you know? Lost mine years ago, of course." A search of his cottage later revealed only a bottle of aspirin tablets, but the story had served its purpose in adding to the general confusion. Meanwhile, young Trent continued his duties, sorting papers and answering police questions with nervous politeness. He mentioned to Miss Marple that Mr. Pendergast had quarreled bitterly with the Colonel shortly before the latter's death, something about a secret hidden in the silver. The Epern again. Miss Marple decided it was time for a closer look. Under cover of returning a borrowed catalogue, she visited the locked stables with Trent's reluctant permission. The great silver piece stood on its table, gleaming coldly under the dust sheet. She lifted it carefully, testing its weight, noting the fine chasing on the branches. Beautiful, yes. But something about it nagged at her memory. She had seen similar pieces, and this one seemed, perhaps, heavier than it should, or lighter, hard to tell without comparison. As she replaced it, her foot dislodged something beneath the table, a small lace-edged handkerchief embroidered in one corner with the initials V.B. Victor Blaine's, perhaps, carelessly dropped during his prolonged examination, or placed there deliberately. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the leaves, and Miss Marple walked home slowly. Clues were beginning to appear. The scent of almonds, the little bottle, the quarrel over hidden silver, the handkerchief, the anonymous letter. Red herrings and genuine pointers mingled together as they so often did. But somewhere in the pattern, the truth was waiting to be discerned by someone who understood the subtleties of human nature. And Miss Marple, casting off the pink jacket with satisfaction and beginning a new row, felt that the pattern was slowly, very slowly, beginning to take shape. Chapter 4. A False Trail. Inspector Slack's arrival in St. Mary Mead was marked by a certain brisk efficiency that the village found both reassuring and slightly irritating. He interviewed everyone who had been at the preview, took statements, and very soon fixed his attention upon Mr. Victor Blaine, the London antiques dealer. It was not difficult to see why. Within a day of the inspector's inquiries, a story emerged of a scandal some years earlier in which Blaine had been accused, though never charged, of selling a piece with questionable provenance. The accusation had been withdrawn, but mud, as the village knew, has a way of sticking. Moreover, Blaine's hurried departure for London on the morning after Pendergast's death looked, in Inspector Slack's eyes, remarkably like flight. Blaine was traced without difficulty and brought back to Much Benham police station for questioning. The news spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. At the Women's Institute Emergency Committee meeting, Miss Hartnell declared roundly that she had always distrusted those London dealers, and Mrs. Price Ridley nodded vigorous agreement. Miss Marple listened to it all with her usual mild expression, but privately she was not convinced. Blaine was sharp, certainly, and ambitious, but murder seemed a drastic step merely to avoid exposure of some irregularity in provenance. She decided to pursue a different line. On a morning when the frost still lingered in the shadows, she walked once more to Meadowbrook House and sought out Gladys the maid, who was beating rugs in the backyard. "Gladys, dear," Miss Marple began, "you mentioned Mr. Pendergast's little bottle of tonic. Was it kept on his desk in the office all the time?" "Yes, miss, always in the same place, right by the inkstand. He'd take a sip whenever he felt a bit queasy after lunch." "And did anyone else ever go into that office alone?" Gladys considered, rug-beater poised. "Well, Mr. Trent was in and out, of course, and Mrs. Dane came once or twice about papers. Major Palgrave poked his head in looking for a catalogue. But mostly it was just Mr. Pendergast himself." Miss Marple thanked her and walked slowly back through the garden, noting as she passed that the foxgloves, though dying back now, had been plentiful in summer. Digitalis could be extracted from foxglove leaves, but that applied to the kernel rather than Pendergast. Cyanide was another matter. That same afternoon, Major Palgrave called upon her, full of importance. "Thought you'd like to know, Miss Marple. Police searched my cottage yesterday. Looking for poison, don't you know. All because of my Indian stories. Found nothing but aspirin and a bottle of tonic wine. Felt rather a fool, the sergeant did." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I am sure he did, but such searches are routine, Major." "Routine be hanged," the Major snorted. "They're barking up the wrong tree. If you ask me, it's that young Trent, ambitious as they come, always hovering round Pendergast, picking up tips, waiting for his chance." It was a point of view shared by several villagers. Young men in a hurry, they felt, were capable of anything. Yet when Miss Marple called at the auctioneer's office in the High Street to return a misplaced catalogue, she found Trent pale and anxious, sorting papers with trembling hands. "They've taken Mr. Blaine away," he said, "but he'll be released soon enough, mark my words. He's got influence, and meanwhile the business is at a standstill." "These delays are very trying," Miss Marple agreed. "But I wonder, did Mr. Pendergast ever mention anything to you about the Epernay being unusual in any way?" Trent hesitated. "He did say once that it felt heavier than it should. Thought perhaps the base was solid silver instead of hollow, but when we weighed it against the catalogue description it matched." He laughed it off. Heavier than it should. Miss Marple tucked the remark away. A further distraction arose when Miss Hartnell's silver flask, an item she had withdrawn from the sale at the last moment, was discovered missing from her house. Inside the flask, when it was later recovered from a ditch near the stables, was a faint residue that smelled faintly of bitter almonds. Miss Hartnell declared indignantly that it had been stolen and the poison planted to incriminate her. Inspector Slack, confronted with this new development, began to look harassed. Blaine was released for lack of evidence. The flask residue proved too small for conclusive tests. Major Palgrave's aspirin was harmless. The colonel's post-mortem results arrived at last. Traces of an overdose of digitalis, sufficient to cause heart failure in a man already weakened. Poison then in both cases, but administered differently. Suspicion swung back to Mrs. Dane, who had access to foxgloves and whose inheritance depended on the house remaining unsold. She had been staying at Gossington Hall at the time of the colonel's death, with ample opportunity to tamper with his medicine. Mrs. Bantry, loyal as ever, defended her guest stoutly. Lydia was devoted to her uncle, and besides, she was in London when Pendergast died, staying at her club. Dozens of people saw her there. Alibis, motives, opportunities, everything circled and contradicted. Inspector Slack announced publicly that the case was progressing, which everyone knew meant he was baffled. Miss Marple, finishing the pink border of the baby jacket and beginning a new project, a pair of bed socks in pale blue, felt that the false trails were multiplying exactly as they so often did when the truth lay hidden in something much simpler. The handkerchief with VB still nagged at her. Victor Blaine had denied owning it when questioned. Perhaps it belonged to someone else entirely. Initials, after all, were not always what they seemed. Outside, a light rain began to fall, pattering on the leaves and turning the village lanes to mud. Inside, the fire crackled comfortably and Miss Marple's needles clicked on, steady and unhurried. The pattern was still confused, but she was beginning to see where certain threads might lead. Chapter 5. Deeper Shadows. The postponement of the auction stretched into weeks, and Meadowbrook House stood silent under lowering November skies. The village, having exhausted the first flush of speculation, settled into a quieter but no less persistent curiosity. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted how the principal figures moved through their days. Mrs. Dane pale and withdrawn at Gossington Hall. Mr. Blaine returned from London but keeping to himself at the Blue Boar. Young Trent working alone in the auction office with an air of strained importance. Major Palgrave striding about with his stick, retailing his Indian stories to anyone who would listen. And Miss Hartnell throwing herself into parish activities with even more than her usual energy. It was at the village fete, held rather late in the season to raise funds for the church roof, that Miss Marple had opportunity to observe them all together again. Stalls lined the village hall, white elephant, cakes, produce, and a bran tub for the children. The air smelled of damp leaves and hot tea. Mrs. Dane helped Mrs. Bantry at the cake stall, arranging Victoria sponges with mechanical care. Miss Marple paused to purchase a small fruit cake. "You are looking tired, my dear," she said gently. Mrs. Dane managed a wan smile. "It has been a difficult time. First Uncle Reginald, then this dreadful business with poor Mr. Pendergast. The police seem to think—" She broke off. "They must explore every possibility," Miss Marple replied, "though I am sure they will find nothing to reflect upon you." From the cake stall she moved to the White Elephant, where Major Palgrave was examining a set of ivory chessmen with loud enthusiasm. "Fine carving, these. Reminds me of a set I had in Simla. Lost it in a fire, along with rather a good pistol." Miss Marple murmured appreciation and passed on to where Mr. Blaine stood alone beside the second-hand books, turning over volumes with quick professional fingers. "You are remaining in the village longer than you expected, Mr. Blaine." He gave her a sharp glance. "Business, Miss Marple. The sale may yet go forward. And there are one or two pieces I should like to examine more closely when permission is granted." "The Epergne, perhaps?" His eyes narrowed. "Among others. It is a remarkable piece. There is, a rumor, only a rumor, that it contains a concealed compartment." Such things were not uncommon in Georgian silver, smuggling family jewels during troubled times, you know. Miss Marple looked innocent. Indeed. How fascinating. Though I suppose if anything were hidden there, Colonel Hargreaves would have known. Perhaps, Blaine said dryly. Or perhaps not. He was not, I believe, a man who paid much attention to family history. Young Trent appeared at her elbow carrying a tray of raffle tickets. Miss Marple, would you care for a ticket? First prize is a hamper from Fortnum's, Mrs. Bantry's contribution. She bought 3 and watched him move away. There was a new confidence in his bearing, as though the absence of his employer had already begun to feel permanent. Later, as the fete drew to a close and stalls were dismantled, Miss Marple found herself alone for a moment with Mr. Blaine near the tea urn. "Tell me, Mr. Blaine," she said quietly, "did you ever discover whether the rumor about the compartment was true?" He hesitated, then gave a slight shrug. "I examined the piece as closely as I dared. The base unscrews, quite cleverly concealed, but it was empty." "Empty," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yet something had been there once." "Possibly. There were faint scratches inside, as though a small packet had been stored and removed." "A hidden compartment, then, and something valuable taken out. A diamond brooch, perhaps, or papers. Something worth killing for." That evening, walking home in the dusk, Miss Marple turned the new information over in her mind. If the colonel had hidden something in the Epergne, and Pendergast had discovered it, either the hiding place or its emptiness, then blackmail or greed might have supplied a motive. She recalled Trent's earlier remark about a quarrel between Pendergast and the colonel concerning a secret in the silver. Pendergast might have demanded payment for silence or threatened exposure. The following day brought confirmation of a different sort. Dr. Haydock called upon her professionally. Her rheumatism had been troublesome in the damp weather, and over a cup of tea confided what he could. The police toxicologist is certain now. Pendergast died of cyanide poisoning, prussic acid, administered very shortly before his collapse, and the colonel had a massive overdose of digitalis far beyond any therapeutic dose. "Both poisons, then," Miss Marple murmured. "Both, and both capable of producing what looks like heart failure to a casual observer." Miss Marple nodded. "The colonel's own medicine bottles were on his desk, I believe. Easy enough to substitute stronger tablets. But the cyanide, how was that given?" Haydock frowned. "That's the puzzle. No food or drink seems to have been tampered with except possibly that tonic bottle, but it was nearly empty and tests were inconclusive." After the doctor left, Miss Marple sat long by her fire. Footprints had been found in the soft earth outside the stable office window. Small, neat prints made by a woman's shoe or a man's unusually narrow one. Trent, she recalled, wore rather pointed patent shoes, size 8, small for a man. But Mrs. Dane also wore elegant narrow shoes, and Miss Hartnell sensible brogues that might leave a similar mark. The shadows deepened, both outside her window and in the case itself. Greed, fear, ambition, all present in abundance. Yet the true pattern still eluded her. She picked up her knitting again, bed socks now in a soothing pale blue, and let her thoughts drift to parallels. There had been a case in the village years ago, a greedy nephew and poisoned tonic, and another where a hidden jewel had caused 2 deaths. Somewhere, she felt sure, the everyday and the deadly were intertwined, waiting only for the right pair of eyes to see them clearly. Chapter 6. Twists in the Tale. November slipped into December, and a light frost silvered the lawns of St. Mary Mead each morning. The police inquiries continued, but with no announcement of an arrest, the village began to feel that the whole affair might fade into one of those unsolved mysteries that are occasionally whispered about over tea. Inspector Slack had returned to his headquarters at Much Benham. leaving a sergeant to tie up loose ends, and the atmosphere of tension eased a little. Miss Marple, however, was far from satisfied. She spent more time than usual in her small garden, wrapped in an old woolen shawl, pruning late roses and turning over the soil while her mind worked steadily upon the problem. The hidden compartment in the épergne, now confirmed as empty, had altered everything. A valuable object, almost certainly jewelry, had been concealed there by Colonel Hargreaves, removed at some point, and its disappearance had led to 2 deaths. Who had known of its existence? Who had opportunity to take it? And who had most to fear from Mr. Pendergast's sharp eyes and sharper tongue? On a particularly cold afternoon, she accepted an invitation to tea with Miss Hartnell, who lived in a neat villa surrounded by laurel bushes. The drawing room was warm and rather overcrowded with furniture, and the tea strong. "I cannot help feeling," Miss Hartnell said briskly, passing a plate of macaroons, "that the police have been extremely slow. That young Trent now, he has benefited most directly. With Mr. Pendergast gone, the business will fall to him. Mark my words, ambition is a dangerous thing." Miss Marple took a macaroon and nibbled it thoughtfully. "Ambition, yes, though greed is often stronger. Tell me, did you ever hear any whisper about something hidden in the family silver at Meadowbrook?" Miss Hartnell's eyes sharpened. "Only what everyone knew, that the Colonel was eccentric and disliked banks. He was always saying jewels were safer at home than in some vault. But nothing definite." From Miss Hartnell's, she walked to the Blue Boar and found Mr. Blaine in the lounge, reading the Times by the fire. "You are still with us, Mr. Blaine." He folded the paper and gave a thin smile. "For the moment. The police have returned my catalogue notes, and the sale is to be rearranged for the new year. I shall stay until it is concluded." Miss Marple sat opposite him. "The épergne will be the star lot, I suppose." "Undoubtedly, though its value may be less than expected if the rumor of a concealed jewel proves unfounded." "Or greater," Miss Marple said mildly, "if the jewel were to reappear." Blaine's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened on the newspaper. "Quite." That same evening, young Trent called upon her, ostensibly to return a book on porcelain marks she had lent him. He looked tired and on edge. "The police have been asking again about the Colonel's quarrel with Mr. Pendergast," he said. "It was over the valuation of the épergne. The Colonel insisted it was worth far more than the catalogue figure, hinted at something special about it. Mr. Pendergast laughed and said if there was anything hidden, he'd soon find it. 2 days later, the Colonel was dead." Miss Marple nodded. "And then Mr. Pendergast himself began to feel uneasy." Trent shifted uncomfortably. "He did say, only once, that he thought he'd made a mistake trusting someone. But he wouldn't tell me who." A mistake trusting someone. The phrase lingered in Miss Marple's mind. The next development came unexpectedly. Mrs. Dane, who had been staying quietly with Mrs. Bantry, announced that she intended to return to London. Mrs. Bantry, distressed, confided the news over the telephone. "She says she can't bear to remain here with all the whispers, but Jane, I'm sure she's hiding something. She's been burning papers in the grate. Old letters from the Colonel," she said. Burning papers. Evidence, perhaps, or merely sentimental memories. Miss Marple decided it was time for decisive action. She wrote a polite note to Inspector Slack suggesting that the épergne be examined again by an expert silversmith, and received a grudging acknowledgement. 2 days later, the report came. The base did indeed unscrew. The compartment was lined with faded silk, and faint traces of adhesive suggested that a small packet had been secured there until quite recently. More importantly, microscopic scratches inside the compartment matched the shape of a diamond brooch known to have belonged to the Colonel's mother, a famous piece that had vanished from the family many years earlier. and was presumed sold to pay gambling debts. The brooch, then, had been hidden by the colonel to prevent its sale. Someone had discovered the hiding place, removed it, and killed first the colonel to inherit freely, then Pendergast to prevent exposure. Suspicion settled heavily upon Mrs. Dane. She had access to the colonel's study, knew his habits, could have substituted digitalis tablets in his medicine bottle. Her alibi for Pendergast's death was strong. She had been in London, but a fast train could have brought her back and taken her away again unnoticed. Yet something did not fit. Mrs. Dane had wept genuinely over her uncle. Greed seemed foreign to her nature. Miss Marple sat late that night by her bedroom fire, knitting abandoned in her lap. She thought of the small footprints, the handkerchief with VB, the little bottle of tonic, the quarrel over a secret in the silver. Suddenly a small, seemingly trivial memory surfaced. Young Trent, pouring tea for visitors during the preview, had handled the colonel's medicine bottle when helping to clear the study after the first death. He had access to Dr. Haydock's surgery, dispensing occasional prescriptions for the doctor's poorer patients. Digitalis tablets would not be difficult to obtain, and cyanide, prussic acid, was used in small quantities by photographers and jewelers. Trent had once mentioned an interest in amateur photography. The twists were becoming clearer. Greed, not inheritance, had been the motive. The brooch, worth a fortune, had been removed by someone who planned to sell it quietly after the fuss died down. Outside, the frost hardened under a clear moon, and Miss Marple rose at last to draw her curtains. The pattern was almost complete. Only one or two threads remained to be drawn together. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would see it whole. Chapter 7. Narrowing the Circle. The Christmas decorations began to appear in St. Mary Mead, holly wreaths on doors, paper chains in the village hall, and a tall tree in the church porch waiting to be dressed. Yet the shadow of the unsolved deaths lingered, and conversation still turned inevitably to Meadowbrook House and its tragedies. Miss Marple received a telephone call from Inspector Slack one cold morning. His voice was gruff but less dismissive than usual. "That suggestion of yours about the Ypern compartment was useful, Miss Marple. We've confirmed the brooch was there, family piece worth upwards of £5,000. The colonel must have hidden it to keep it out of the sale." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "And now it is missing." "Exactly. Whoever took it had motive enough for 2 murders. We're concentrating on those who had access to both victims." After the call, she sat quietly with her knitting, reviewing each suspect in turn. Mrs. Dane had known the family stories, might have guessed at the hiding place, and stood to gain by delaying or preventing the sale. Yet her grief had seemed genuine, and the cruelty of poisoning her uncle sat ill with her gentle nature. Mr. Blaine, with his expert knowledge, could have identified the compartment quickly and removed the brooch during the preview. But he had been under scrutiny from the moment of Pendergast's collapse, and the earlier poisoning of the colonel would have required planning he could scarcely have undertaken on a brief country visit. Major Palgrave's bluster concealed a harmless old gentleman who collected ivories but had no real need of money. His tales of cyanide were exaggeration, not confession. Miss Hartnell was fierce in her opinions but transparently honest. The idea of her creeping about with poisons was absurd. That left young Lionel Trent. Trent had been in and out of Meadowbrook constantly during the cataloging. He had helped clear the colonel's desk after death, handled the medicine bottles, assisted Pendergast with every lot including the Ypern. He had access to drugs through his occasional errands for Dr. Haydock. He mixed tea, carried messages, ran errands, always helpful, always present, and he was ambitious. With Pendergast gone, the business would be his. With the brooch in his possession, he could sell it quietly through London contacts and set himself up independently. Miss Marple decided upon a small experiment. She invited Trent to tea, mentioning casually that she had won a small silver vase at the postponed auction raffle and wished advice on its value. He arrived promptly, neatly dressed, his manner polite but with a faint unease in his eyes. The tea was laid in the drawing room, thin bread and butter, scones, and a seed cake. Miss Marple poured from her best Crown Derby pot. "I have been thinking about poor Mr. Pendergast's little bottle of tonic," she said conversationally as she passed his cup. "Such a convenience for indigestion. I believe you sometimes fetched refills for him from the chemist." Trent stirred his tea carefully. "Now and then, yes. It was only a harmless mixture, bicarbonate and peppermint mostly. Yet so easy to add something stronger," Miss Marple murmured. "A few drops of prussic acid, for instance. It acts very quickly." Trent's spoon clattered against the saucer. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." She regarded him mildly over her spectacles. "I mean that someone added cyanide to that bottle, knowing Mr. Pendergast would take a dose after lunch. Someone who had already substituted digitalis tablets in the Colonel's bottle, causing an overdose that looked like natural heart failure." Trent set down his cup. "That is a serious accusation." "Not yet an accusation," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Merely an observation. You see, the Colonel discovered that you had been undervaluing certain lots deliberately, planning to buy them cheaply yourself after the sale. He threatened exposure, so he had to die. Then Mr. Pendergast, weighing the epergne, felt its unusual balance, unscrewed the base, and found the brooch. He realized its value, and yours in removing it. He, too, became dangerous." Trent's face had gone very pale. "This is nonsense. You have no proof." "Perhaps not yet," Miss Marple admitted. "But there is the handkerchief with the initials VB found under the table. Not Victor Blaine's at all. It was your mother's, I believe. Violet Blanche, before she married. You carried it for luck, as boys sometimes do. And the small footprints outside the office window. Size 8 patent shoes are unusual in a man, but you prefer a neat fit." Trent rose abruptly. "I think I should go." "As you wish," Miss Marple said serenely. "Though I believe Inspector Slack is waiting in the hall. He has a warrant to search your rooms. The brooch, I fancy, will be found hidden there." The door opened at that moment, and Inspector Slack entered with a constable. Trent stood rigid, his ambition and greed laid bare in the quiet drawing room. Later, when the formalities were complete and the brooch recovered from behind a loose brick in Trent's chimney, Mrs. Bantry arrived, breathless for tea. "Jane, you are marvelous. How did you know it was Trent all along?" Miss Marple poured a fresh cup. "I did not know at first, dear. But little things. The way he hovered, the nervousness when poison was mentioned, the small shoes, the handkerchief. And then there was the parallel. I remembered a young man in the village 20 years ago who poisoned his aunt for a small legacy. Exactly the same type, quiet, helpful, ambitious. Human nature repeats itself so faithfully." Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, soft and silent. Inside, the fire glowed, and the mystery that had troubled St. Mary Mead was narrowing at last to its true and sordid center. Simple greed, dressed in everyday clothes. Chapter 8. The Vital Clue. With Lionel Trent in custody and the missing brooch recovered, St. Mary Mead breathed a collective sigh of relief. The auction was rescheduled for the new year under new management, and the village prepared for Christmas with renewed cheer. Yet Miss Marple, though satisfied that justice had been served, felt the need for one final confirmation. A small, loose thread that still tugged at her mind. She invited Mrs. Bantry to tea on a bright, frosty afternoon just before Christmas. The drawing-room fire burned merrily, and the tea table was laid with particular care. Scones warm from the oven, blackberry jam, thin slices of fruitcake, and a plate of Miss Marple's special shortbread. Mrs. Bantry arrived muffled in furs, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Jane, my dear, you are a positive marvel. The whole village is talking of nothing else. Inspector Slack actually telephoned to thank me for the assistance of my friend, meaning you, of course. Though he sounded as though it hurt him to say it." Miss Marple smiled and poured tea. "The inspector is very thorough in his own way, but tell me, Dolly, did Mrs. Dane say anything more about her uncle's papers? You mentioned she had been burning some." Mrs. Bantry helped herself to a scone. "Only that they were old love letters from years ago, nothing to do with the present trouble. She seemed quite composed now that it's all over. She's going back to London after Christmas, but she says she may keep Meadowbrook after all, once the debts are settled properly." Miss Marple nodded. "A happy outcome. But there was one small point that puzzled me until yesterday. The handkerchief with the initials VB." Mrs. Bantry looked up, butter knife poised. "I thought that belonged to Mr. Blaine." "So did everyone at first, but Victor Blaine's full name is Victor Charles Blaine. No B for a second initial. And the handkerchief was fine lawn, lace-edged, hardly a gentleman's. No, it was Trent's mother's. Violet Blanche Trent. He had kept it since her death, a sentimental keepsake. He dropped it under the table when he unscrewed the epergne base to remove the brooch. A tiny oversight, but fatal." Mrs. Bantry gave a delighted shiver. "How perfectly dreadful. And how perfectly like you to notice it, Jane." "There was another clue," Miss Marple continued tranquilly. "That seemed unimportant at the time. Trent wore unusually small shoes, size 8, narrow-fitting. The footprints outside the office window, where someone had stood watching Pendergast take his fatal dose, were small and pointed. A woman's, we all thought, or a man who preferred elegant footwear." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Poor young man. Vanity was his undoing." "Vanity and greed," Miss Marple corrected gently. "He had been systematically undervaluing certain lots, planning to buy them himself at knockdown prices after the sale. The Colonel discovered it and threatened exposure. Trent substituted stronger digitalis tablets in the Colonel's daily dose, easy enough since he often ran errands to the surgery. Then, when Pendergast weighed the epergne and found it lighter than expected, he investigated, discovered the empty compartment, and realized what had happened. Trent overheard him telephoning a colleague in London about a valuable discovery. So Pendergast, too, had to be silenced." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "And the cyanide. Trent had a small quantity for his photographic developing. He was an enthusiastic amateur. A few drops in the tonic bottle, knowing Pendergast's habit of taking a sip every afternoon. It was quick, painless, and looked exactly like heart failure." Mrs. Bantry set down her cup. "It's quite horrible when you think of it calmly over tea. That nice-looking young man, always so polite." Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "That is the danger, Dolly. Evil so often wears a pleasant face. I remembered a similar case years ago, a young clerk in a solicitor's office who poisoned his employer for promotion. Exactly the same type. Quiet, helpful, ambitious. Human nature does not change." Outside, the short winter afternoon was drawing to a close and the first lamps twinkled in the village street. Inside, the two old friends sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the flames. Mrs. Bantry sighed contentedly. "Well, it's all over now. The brooch will go to Mrs. Dane, I suppose, and the sale can proceed honestly. And we can have a peaceful Christmas." Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, a new baby jacket, this time in pale lemon. "Yes, dear. Peaceful and properly appreciative of our blessings, though I confess I shall miss the little excitement." Mrs. Bantry chuckled. "You'll find another puzzle soon enough, Jane. You always do." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Perhaps. But for now, another scone." And so, over tea and shortbread, The last threads of the auction house mystery were quietly tied off, leaving only the gentle rhythm of village life and the promise of Christmas peace. Chapter 9. The Gathering in the Drawing Room. The snow that had threatened for days arrived at last on Christmas Eve, soft and thick, muffling the sounds of St. Mary Mead and turning the village into a picture postcard. Miss Marple, looking out of her window that morning, decided that the time had come for a final clearing of the air. She sent out a few careful invitations, polite little notes suggesting tea on the afternoon of Christmas Day, and received acceptances from all concerned. Her small drawing room was festooned with holly and a modest string of paper chains made by the Girl Guides. A fire blazed cheerfully, the tea table was laid with her best cloths and the Crown Derby service, and plates of sandwiches, scones, mince pies, and a rich Dundee cake waited under covers. The guests arrived punctually. First came Mrs. Bantry with Mrs. Dane, both wrapped in furs against the cold. Then Major Palgrave, stamping snow from his boots and booming seasonal greetings. Miss Hartnell followed, brisk in a green wool coat. Mr. Blaine arrived last, quiet and watchful as always. Inspector Slack, invited at Miss Marple's particular request, stationed himself discreetly in the hall with a constable, ready if needed. Miss Marple greeted them all with gentle warmth, settled them in chairs around the fire, and began to pour tea. "You must be wondering why I have asked you here on Christmas afternoon," she began mildly, passing a cup to Mrs. Dane. "It is because this unfortunate business at Meadowbrook has cast a shadow over the village for too long, and I felt we should clear it away before the new year." Major Palgrave accepted a mince pie. "Capital idea, Miss Marple, though I thought the police had the fellow, young Trent." "They have," Miss Marple agreed, "but there are one or two points that remain to be explained, and I thought it kinder to do so here among friends rather than in a police station." A small stir went round the room. Mr. Blaine set down his cup untouched. Miss Marple continued tranquilly. "Two men died, both apparently of heart failure. Colonel Hargreaves first, then Mr. Pendergast. But both deaths were caused by poison. Digitalis in the colonel's case, cyanide in Mr. Pendergast's. The motive in both instances was the same: a magnificent diamond brooch hidden for years in a secret compartment in the Georgian Epergne. She paused to refill Miss Hartnell's cup. "Many of us here had reason to be suspected at one time or another. Mrs. Dane wished to preserve the family silver and delay the sale. Major Palgrave told alarming stories about cyanide. Miss Hartnell was angry about valuations. Mr. Blaine was thought to have professional reasons for wishing irregularity concealed. Even I wondered about young Trent's ambition." Mrs. Bantry gave a little gasp. "Jane, you are being positively dramatic." Miss Marple smiled. "Only a little, dear. But the truth is simpler and sadder. Lionel Trent discovered the hidden compartment while cataloging the silver. He removed the brooch, planning to sell it later for a fortune. The colonel, noticing the Epergne's altered weight, accused him of theft. Trent, in panic, substituted stronger digitalis tablets in the colonel's daily medicine. Easy, since he often collected prescriptions from Dr. Haydock's surgery. Major Palgrave cleared his throat noisily. "Damned cold-blooded." "Very," Miss Marple agreed. Then Mr. Pendergast, weighing the piece for insurance, felt the difference, unscrewed the base, and found the compartment empty. He realized what had happened and intended to expose Trent. So Trent, who mixed tea and ran errands, added a few drops of prussic acid, obtained for his photographic work, to Mr. Pendergast's tonic bottle. Death was almost instantaneous. Mrs. Dane shuddered. How dreadful to think we all drank tea with him that afternoon. Miss Marple nodded. Small clues pointed the way. The faint scent of bitter almonds, the small pointed footprints outside the office window, the lace handkerchief embroidered VB, Not Victor Blaine's, but Violet Blanche, Trent's mother. He had carried it as a keepsake and dropped it in his haste. Mr. Blaine spoke for the first time. "And the undervaluations?" "A side scheme," Miss Marple explained. "Trent planned to buy valuable pieces cheaply after deliberately low estimates. Greed upon greed. When I invited him here and mentioned certain facts, he realized the net was closing. The police were waiting, and the brooch was found hidden in his rooms." Inspector Slack entered at that moment, his face red from the cold. "All correct, Miss Marple. Trent has confessed fully. Saved us a deal of trouble." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am glad. And now perhaps we can put this unhappy affair behind us. Another mince pie, Major?" The atmosphere lightened perceptibly. Conversation turned to Christmas plans, the beauty of the snow, the church service that evening. Mrs. Dane expressed quiet gratitude that her uncle's treasured brooch would now return to the family. Mr. Blaine announced his intention to bid fairly when the sale resumed. Even Inspector Slack accepted a piece of Dundee cake before departing. As the guests left one by one into the softly falling snow, Mrs. Bantry lingered. "You really are extraordinary, Jane. A proper drawing-room denouement, just like in books." Miss Marple smiled as she closed the door. "It seemed kinder, Dolly. And after all, it is Christmas." Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Reflection. The new year arrived quietly in St. Mary Mead, with crisp, frosty mornings and a thin blanket of snow that lingered in the shady corners of gardens. The auction at Meadowbrook House had been successfully concluded under impartial supervision, the debts settled, and the diamond brooch restored to Mrs. Dane, who had decided to keep the house after all. Life resumed its gentle rhythm. Church bells on Sunday, the postman's daily round, the occasional motor car chugging along the high street. On a bright morning in early January, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room with the sun streaming through the windows, her knitting needles busy with a new project, a warm scarf and soft heather wool. The post had brought a polite note of thanks from Mrs. Dane, and a rather grudging one from Inspector Slack acknowledging valuable civilian assistance. She had just finished reading them when the maid announced Mrs. Bantry. Dolly Bantry swept in, cheeks glowing from the cold air, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Jane, dear, I've brought you some of that new Assam tea from Fortnum's. Mrs. Dane sent it as a thank you, and I simply had to come and hear your thoughts now that everything is truly settled." Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and rang for fresh tea things. "How kind of her. And of you, Dolly. Do sit by the fire. It's still sharp outside." The tea arrived promptly. A pot of the fragrant new Assam, thin slices of brown bread and butter, and a plate of Miss Marple's homemade ginger biscuits. Mrs. Bantry settled herself comfortably and helped herself liberally. "Well, Jane," she began eagerly, "was there ever a more satisfying ending? Young Trent transported for trial, the brooch safe, and Meadowbrook remaining in the family. Though I must say I still find it hard to believe that pleasant young man capable of such wickedness." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. "It is always difficult to believe, dear. That is why such crimes so often succeed for a time. Evil hides behind ordinary faces. Trent was helpful, polite, ambitious, qualities we approve of. But ambition turned to greed, and greed to murder." Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. "Greed for that brooch, £5,000, enough to set anyone up for life." "More than enough," Miss Marple agreed. "And he nearly succeeded. If he had not dropped his mother's handkerchief, or if his shoes had been of a more ordinary size, or if he had resisted the temptation to undervalue other pieces as well. So many small threads that might have remained untangled." Mrs. Bantry sipped her tea appreciatively. "But you untangled them, Jane. How you do it I shall never understand. All those red herrings. Poor Mr. Blaine suspected, then Major Palgrave with his alarming stories, Miss Hartnell and her flask, even Lydia Dane with the foxgloves in the garden. We were all quite at sea. Miss Marple smiled gently. Red herrings are part of human nature too, Dolly. People suspect one another so readily. Old grudges, little jealousies. But in the end, the truth is usually simple. Someone wanted something very much and was prepared to kill to get it. She paused, looking out at the garden where a robin hopped across the frosty lawn. I am only glad it is over. The village can settle again. Mrs. Dane will make Meadowbrook a home once more, I think. And the auction raised more than expected. Honesty does pay in the long run. Mrs. Bantry laughed. Thanks to you, though I dare say Inspector Slack will take the credit officially. Let him, Miss Marple said tranquilly. Credit matters little. What matters is that justice is done and peace restored. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the wintry sunlight and listening to the faint tick of the clock on the mantelpiece. Outside, children's voices rang out as they coasted on a small slope near the green, their laughter bright in the cold air. Mrs. Bantry set down her cup at last. Well, Jane, you have given us all a quiet Christmas after all, though I confess I shall miss the excitement a little. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. There will be other puzzles, dear. Life in a village is never entirely without them. But for now, another ginger biscuit? Mrs. Bantry accepted with alacrity, and the two old friends lingered over their tea, warmed by the fire and by the comfortable certainty that, in St. Mary Mead at least, truth and goodness had prevailed once more. The auction house mystery was closed, its lessons absorbed into the quiet wisdom of the village, and the gentle days rolled peacefully onward under the winter sun.